Welcome to Weekly Recaps, where we discuss some of the top stories in business, technology, and politics. Kicking it off, NVIDIA has partnered with Microsoft, Dell, and HP to provide personal computers with AI agents at the core of the device. The RTX Spark, which is their new superchip, will be at the core of these PCs, and it's designed to be fast and have the ability to handle complex tasks that may be required for agentic tasks with OpenClaw or Hermes, some of your industry core models such as Opus and Codex. You can see here there's a handful of PC makers that are going to be implementing chips into some of their PCs. Although AI agents is a key target of this chip, I'm sure a handful of these companies will be targeting the gaming industry and users that have more intense graphic demands. So now Jensen Huang and NVIDIA are making a transition into CPUs, as well as selling their traditional GPUs. And per his words, it seems like there's a lot more room for improvement. Next, Iran has responded to Israeli airstrikes on Lebanon, and this was only public a couple hours ago at the time of the recording, but essentially earlier this morning, Israel launched an airstrike targeting a certain district in Beirut, which is the capital of Lebanon, where they believed there was Hezbollah militants. They're backed by Iran, and a few hours later, Iran retaliated by launching missiles towards Israel. I believe that it's the first time Iran has retaliated since the ceasefire back in April. So it appears in these negotiations with the US and Iran wants to maintain jurisdiction and some of their military operations within Lebanon, whereas Israel sees this as a threat. The U.S. potentially sees this as a threat. So I think that's one of the couple bottlenecks that we're still facing as this crisis continues. And unfortunately, there's likely to be further actions taken since Iran has retaliated. So I would expect this conflict to continue for at least another couple months. AI, the two frontier models, are still considered Anthropic and OpenAI, and both of them have teased about going public in the near future. And as this has come up, there has been more regulation and security concerns. So pretty soon we're going to see a lot more government intervention and auditing in this space. And due to that, Trump has officially signed the executive order to allow the government to have a review period for frontier models. So the point of this is to kind of gatekeep the public from having access to tools that are too powerful. As we mentioned last week in Pope Leo's encyclical, he mentioned having organizations that are dedicated as watchers to the watchers, which the objective with this executive order is to essentially become that. So for better or for worse, there will likely be an oversight committee set up to make decisions on behalf of what models get public access and not. And of course, one of the objectives of this is to not constrain AI and the frontier labs, but to allow them to continue to innovate within a set of guardrails that the government sets. And it looks like the CISA will be the dedicated resource to ensuring that the frontier labs maintain a certain security protocol. Alphabet recently announced that they plan on spending double of what they did in 2025 in CapEx for their AI, which blows most of the Mag 7 or Mag 8 companies out of the water. And of course, Alphabet has a lot more cash reserves than most of those companies other than Apple. But as I mentioned a few weeks ago, Apple's kind of taken a backseat to this whole AI wave. As majority of Apple's focus has continued to be on hardware, I guess we'll see how they plan on implementing software in the future. And it cites most of this spend likely being due to their revenue increases on their cloud business, which have almost grown 50% year. So based on what Sundar Pichai is saying here, it seems like they're going to take the infrastructure play, continuing to bet on cloud computing, server capacity, and power. And as I mentioned Apple earlier, you can see they're outsourcing some of their model development to Google, which obviously is going to boost Google's capacity and diminish Apple's. Onto Meta. Of the hyperscalers, they've been the ones to receive the most backlash with the last few months and even last few years with how they've been monitoring their employees. And now it seems like they're facing internal backlash regarding employee monitoring. So essentially Meta was collecting a lot of keystrokes and mouse movements to train their AI models on what their employees do. And now they're going to allow employees to request 30-minute periods at a time where AI won't be trained on their critical work. So this is all kind of unfolding with the layoffs and the monitoring and the lack of transparency that leadership at Meta has provided to employees. So it's really hard to say. Obviously, from a humanitarian perspective, Meta is doing some pretty questionable things here. But on the side of innovation and technological advancement, it's kind of hard to argue against the process improvement they're doing. Although I don't stand with any of the layoffs and employee monitoring seems pretty extreme, and for most people dystopian, I think it's a pretty innovative approach to training their AI models. So Thursday and Friday of last week were pretty tough on the stock market in general, but Broadcom, who's a semiconductor manufacturer, had their stock drop about 15% due to missing their earnings. But here's the catch. They only missed their earnings by 80 million, and their earnings per share was even higher than estimated. So this is a pretty good example of why companies want to stay private for so long. Because when you're answering to Wall Street and retail investors, the volatility in your market value can vary drastically, even for something that is so small comparatively. Like this is maybe a 0.75% variance on their total revenue. Anyways, I'll step off my soapbox. For the third month in a row, jobs have increased and unemployment is at near historic lows. So although the public sentiment and job market seems to be in a tough spot, the trends are headed in the right direction, especially in industries like manufacturing, where the federal government is putting more resources. And recently, President Trump has called the private sector to push more investments into defense tech and data, cybersecurity. And part of the reason he mentioned this is the public sector has longer time horizons for prospective investments and a more bureaucratic process than venture capital or private investors can. So especially in a time of war, we'd like to speed up the innovation in defense tech. So expect to see that more often from large players like Andreessen Horowitz. And lastly, Congress is trying to do away with personalized pricing, which is where large data companies that have access to your purchasing history are able to optimize the amount you're willing to spend on certain products. And we can see that in this year alone, over 50 bills have been passed in the states to counter large data companies to use that at the expense of the consumer. That's all for this week's recaps. If you enjoyed the video, please do me a great favor and like and subscribe. And if you'd like to see any of the prior weeks, you can click on the playlist here. And thanks for watching.